So was everybody actually really wrong? A video came out yesterday by a YouTuber claiming that everybody was wrong in this debate about where to set our audio interface for our instrument input for our guitars to get the most out of a guitar modeler. Now, I'd like to say first and foremost that I actually agree with everything he said in that video. He was technically 100% correct, and I have no argument with anything he said. It's what I've always believed. But there is a little bit of nuance to this, and it's going to be very important so that we can find a happy middle ground that's going to make our workflow as a guitarist as simple as possible, all while getting the best results. Today, we're going to put this to bed. I'm going to talk about what he mentioned in the video and show you what you should actually be doing. But to find this balance of getting the best workflow with the best audio results in a way that's going to work in the real world and actually sound great. So let's head right over to my DAW and we'll take a look and see what this is all about. All right, so just to show you my setup here, I have a little bit different than what you're used to seeing in my videos, but I have Cubase, which is being fed by my MOTU Ultralight Mark V, and I'm using this audio interface, which is actually the audio interface I use for all of the videos I shoot. And when you're hearing me demo tones, it is actually this instrument input that you're hearing. And I'm going to show you the setting that I use. One thing that's ultra important to understand is that not all audio interfaces are equal as far as when we plug into the instrument input. They're all going to have different maximum input levels. Something like a Line 6 Helix, and we'll just talk about that quickly, has a fixed input level, and it is actually right in the ballpark of an 11.5 dBu of headroom. So how does that equate to other interfaces? Well, what that would mean is if we're using something like a UAD Apollo Twin, we're going to have to actually go in and add only about 1 dB of gain to the instrument input to match something like what the Helix is at. Same with something like a new generation Focusrite Scarlett. We would go in and add 1 dB, the smallest amount of gain. And in fact, if we just left it at minimum gain, we probably wouldn't even hear a difference between that unless we were being very, very critical on the listening. Now, the problem is something like my Ultralight Mark V here, when you measure this instrument input, it actually has a maximum input level of 19 dBu, meaning there's a lot more headroom. So the YouTuber made the video yesterday was using a very inexpensive, cheap, kind of poorly spec'd out Behringer converter. And the interesting thing is, in his own comment section, he kind of comes clean, which is one thing that I would have hoped he would have said in the video so more people heard it. He purposely used a really cheap audio interface with a high amount of headroom and then put it into a super high gain distorted tone to over accentuate the importance of this. That's where he kind of lost me, because that confused a lot of people and now has kind of muddied the waters. So this Ultralight Mark V is very similar to the spec on the Behringer as far as the maximum input level. It's 19 dBu. So what does that mean? If I'm set to 0 here on my instrument input, that's going to be quite a lot of headroom. And I have never been one to suggest just taking every single audio interface and running it at minimum gain. So I agree with him 100% on that. What I don't agree with is this idea that we need to constantly be pushing things up to the point of clipping and then just backing them off again. There's a big issue with that, and I'm going to show you that today. And again, the reason I'm using the Ultralight Mark V is I can show you how this would translate to different audio interfaces. So let's start off here. I'm going to grab my guitar. I'm going to use my fairly low output Vigier Expert Strat. Now keep a look down here on the guitar DI right here. So with this instrument input set low like this, I can come to my guitar and play, and I'll play fairly hard because that's how we want to set our levels. So you see that I am, down here at -17. If I really dig in, which you should, because you don't ever want to have that problem of setting a level and then peaking, I'm at around -14.5. So that tells me that's too low. I would never suggest that somebody set it there, nor have I ever. I always calibrate my system to be very much in the ballpark of where the Line 6 Helix would be. There's a reason the modern audio interfaces and modelers are choosing this 12 dBu, 11 dBu, 12.5 dBu of headroom, because it leaves enough headroom for the vast majority of guitars. Here's the really important point. I don't want to have to change this level every time I change guitars. This guitar has a certain output which is part of its character. I want to capture that when I play this guitar. When I go grab a guitar with a higher output, which I'm going to do shortly, I want that character to be captured. So if I come in here and say, well, I'm going to add, let's see here, I'm going to add 15 dB of gain to my instrument input, like the conventional wisdom tells us. Now when I play this, I'm very close to clipping, so I'm going to come back to 14. You know, for my liking, that's still pretty close, but let's just go with that. Let's remember that number of 14. So now what we've done is we've basically turned this into having a max input level of 5 dBu instead of the 19 that we started off with. Now, what's the problem with this? Well, I'll show you what the problem is. I'm going to keep it set there, and I'm going to grab a guitar that I know has a higher output. So now I have my Vigier Excalibur. This has a DiMarzio tone zone pickup in the bridge. So now what happens is, as soon as we come in here and we play with this plus 14 setting, I'm just way too hot. So now I'm going to have to come over here and I'm going to have to lower this, and let's maybe go down to 10. Let's see what that does. Just reset this. Still too dangerously close to clipping when I hit hard. Let's come down to, let's say 8, and I'm going to reset that again. Now we can see that we don't clip. The highest peaks I can get when I really hit are around -4.5 to -5. I've got some headroom there and everything works great. Well, what's really interesting about this 8 setting on this is this now leaves us with 11 dBu of headroom, the exact same amount that something like a Line 6 Helix is set to by default. It's no accident that it is like that so that it can accommodate a variety of different guitars, and we still have some headroom. If we had a guitar that has even hotter pickups, we're still going to be okay. But now that I set this at this 8 dB setting, does it still work with my Strat? Well, I would say of course it does. So now here I am back on my Strat, bridge pickup. Now obviously it's lower output, but let's see where we're peaking out at. I'm still getting peaks around -8.7. I'm not worried about the signal to noise ratio. As I'm going to show you in a moment, it's really a non-issue and it's not as big a deal as was made out to be in that previous video. So basically, I can set this here, leave it alone, and just be happy to have found a compromise between maxing out our signal to noise ratio without being too close to the point of clipping and ruining my track, while also being able to switch guitars without having to worry about constantly changing this, much like we would do if we were plugging into something like a Line 6 Helix. So the example that was used in this other video was the amount of extra noise that's being introduced when we set our audio interface too low. Now, again, there is a lot of truth to this, but the example that was used was so dramatic and too exaggerated for actual real world use. So I want to do the same thing and show you what's actually going on here. What I have is 3 tracks, all with an instance of Helix Native on them. Now, what's interesting about Helix Native is it has on the input this little green range right here, which is kind of interesting because if we grab a guitar, and I just have this muted right now because I don't want the noise coming through, but if I grab a guitar with my input set to this 8 dB added to my ultralight, which puts it right in line with what the Line 6 Helix would be using, look what happens when I play this guitar. We're right in the nice top of this range, but I also know that Helix Native is going to sound exactly like the Helix because I've calibrated my input level, not at minimum gain. I've never said that. I've never told anybody they should, because we can't say minimum gain on every interface because they're all different. But a lot of modern interfaces, such as Focusrite Scarlett, the newer generation, things like UAD Apollo, and we could just leave that. It's going to be within 1 to 1.5 dB of what something like, for instance, Helix Native is looking for. Now, what I am not talking about here is what a particular amp sim wants to see. The only reason I know that Helix Native wants to see that level is because we have hardware to compare it to. But you'll notice I don't have to worry about this. Now, if I go grab my other guitar, yes, I'm going to be outside that green zone, but that is also a higher output guitar. I want it to hit it harder. That's why we have this headroom left. If I was to come in here and boost this up to that 15 level, now let's take a look. where we're at on Helix Native. With a low output guitar, we're outside of that green zone, and with the high output guitar, we're going to be clipping. So let's just come back to 8. Now, what I really want you to hear is what the true difference is in a more real-world situation and in how I would suggest people run things with this problem, I'll put it in quotes, problem with the noise floor being too loud. So let's start off with the minimum gain setting. So I'm going to come in over to my audio interface and hit 0. Now, we understand that this is actually less than the signal that Helix Native wants to see. We're going to come over to Helix Native here. We're going to make sure that our input is set to 0 just to get a baseline of noise here. I'm going to unmute that channel and hit the monitor button. And then we can measure the amount of noise we have. And you'll notice here, we're at minus 39.4 on our integrated LUFS. So that's basically telling us how much noise we're hearing. So let's keep that number in mind. Now we can get rid of that. We're going to come over now to another instance of Helix Native, and we're going to drop this by 8 dB because we're going to boost the input by 8 dB. And I'm just using the same test that was used in this other video. So now remember, minus 39.5 was the number. We'll clear that out. So you'll notice the noise now has dropped from minus 39.5 down to minus 41.7. So it's a little more than a 2 dB drop in that noise. There you go. It shows that what the other video said is proven correct. Well, it does, but I've never suggested, nor do I think too many people have suggested taking an audio interface like this with a large amount of headroom and running it at minimum. I think that would be too low. We do want to get it up into that compromise zone of not being close to clipping, but in a place where we can maximize the signal to noise ratio. So let's remember this as our new number then, minus 41.7. And now we're going to come over to the other instance of Helix Native. And when I maxed this out to the highest level I could get it to with my Strat without being dangerously close to clipping, I got up to 14 dB of gain added. So I need to come to this instance of Helix Native and bring this down by 14 to compare it. So again, let's go back and forth here between the plus 8 setting, again, just to get a baseline here. Our noise is minus 41.7 on the LUFS. Now we'll come over here. Sorry, I have this labeled minus 16. It should be minus 14. We're going to change this to 14, and we'll see if this minus 41.7 is close here. So we see it says minus 42.7. So we've basically got an improvement in the noise of 1 dB. So is it better? Well, of course it's better. Nobody's arguing that by pushing this as high as we can, we get an improvement technically in the signal to noise ratio, but is it going to be as noticeable as some people want to make out? Well, let's listen to these back to back. I'm going to make these setting changes and edit this in the post so you can hear the difference in this noise back to back without me altering anything about it. So that would be the actual difference in noise between running my instrument input on my Ultralight Mark V at the highest I could run it for my lowest output guitar, meaning I'm going to always have to change that, and running it where I always run it at this 8 dB to bring it in line with most modern audio interfaces' maximum input level at their lowest setting. So just because somebody says that you should max out signal to noise ratio does not make that better. What are the problems that it causes? Well, now we're constantly going to have to be changing settings every single guitar. Keep in mind, this is also on a preset in Helix Native where I've taken a placator dirty, cranked the drive, cranked the master, set it super high overdrive. So this is about the most overdrive you're going to get and is the most extreme example. These differences we're talking about, as soon as we get into lower gain tones, are even going to be less noticeable, and they're almost not noticeable even at this. So my point is we need to find a compromise. Yes, let's get that signal to noise ratio maximized as much as possible, but at the same time in a way so that we don't have to constantly be adjusting this every single time we change guitars. Now, one other really important point that needs to be made, because I know people are going to ask me how this applies to Tonex pedal, and the videos I've done recently about Tonex pedal, is it doesn't apply in any way, shape, or form. Tonex pedal has a fixed maximum input level of 8 dBu. That is just what it is. The global input trim that everybody loves to talk about so much actually adjusts things after the analog to digital converter, so it actually doesn't affect the signal to noise ratio at all. So everything I've ever said about Tonex pedal is completely different than anything that's even being spoken about here before anybody, because I know somebody's going to come along and say that that negates everything that I've said concerning Tonex pedal, and it simply does not. All right, so there you have it. Again, I wasn't trying to argue with anybody on this. I do agree with the YouTuber who put this video out. Technically, he is correct, but there's a little bit of nuance here, like I mentioned, that it's not quite as simple as that if we want to have a nice, simple workflow when we're setting our audio interface to use with our guitar software. So take it for what it's worth. I don't want to tell anybody precisely where to set anything or how they have to do it, only how I do it and how it's benefited me to not only have a much quicker workflow, but to get really great audio results as well. So I hope you enjoyed that. I'm going to leave you today with some music demos for one of my Tonex bundles you can grab at the link below. Please like the video, share it with anybody you think would get some use or enjoyment out of watching it. Also, please subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell notification to get notified when I put new content out. I'll be back really soon with some more. Thank you guys again so much for tuning in. Ciao for now.